Let me ask you something honest. Not a rhetorical opener, not a hook, an actual question worth sitting with. When you look at the people around you who seem to be winning at life, what's your first instinct about why? Most of us land on the same few answers. They're smarter. They got lucky. They had connections, a head start, parents who knew the right people. Or maybe we tell ourselves the most comfortable story of all, that they simply wanted it more, worked harder, sacrificed more sleep and more weekends and more of themselves than we were willing to. Here's the uncomfortable truth. None of those explanations are wrong exactly, but none of them are the real answer either. I've spent years watching people succeed and watching people stagnate. People with identical starting points, comparable intelligence, similar opportunities. And what separates them has almost nothing to do with the factors we obsess over. It's not raw talent. It's not hustle. It's not even luck, though luck plays its role. The real difference is architectural. It lives inside the mind. In the specific way a person processes challenge, interprets failure, makes decisions under pressure, and relates to their own potential. Two people can sit in the same traffic, work in the same office, face the same setback on the same Tuesday afternoon. One of them experiences it as evidence that life is working against them. The other experiences it as information they can use. Same moment, completely different inner worlds. That's what this audiobook is about. Not motivation. Not a collection of habits to bolt onto your existing life. This is about something deeper and more permanent. The actual structure of how your mind operates, and what becomes possible when you deliberately rebuild that structure from the inside out. We're going to go through 15 ideas together. Some of them will feel immediately recognizable. Others will land a few hours later when you're in the shower or staring out a window. A few might make you slightly uncomfortable, and those are probably the ones worth paying the most attention to. I'm not going to promise you overnight transformation. Anyone who does is selling something that doesn't exist. What I will promise is this. By the time we finish, you will understand your own mind at a level most people never reach. And that understanding, applied consistently, changes everything. Not someday. Over time. Which, if you think about it, is exactly how the best things always work. Let's begin. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. Your brain is running outdated code. There's a moment most people have experienced, but rarely name. You get an email from your boss that says simply, "Can we talk later today?" No context, no tone, just those 5 words sitting in your inbox like a small, ticking thing. And before you've even consciously decided to react, something happens in your body. Your chest tightens slightly. Your mind starts running scenarios. What did I do? What's wrong? Is this bad? You haven't read a single additional word. You have zero actual information. But your nervous system has already launched a response, a full internal weather event triggered by 5 completely neutral words. That's not weakness. That's not anxiety. That's your brain doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem is that it was built to do that for a world that no longer exists. Here's the thing, nobody explains clearly enough. Your brain is ancient hardware running in a modern environment. The core architecture of your mind, the parts that govern your emotional responses, your threat detection, your risk assessment. Those parts haven't meaningfully changed in roughly 200,000 years. They were calibrated for a life where the primary dangers were physical, immediate, and often fatal. A rustle in the grass, a rival from another group, a winter with not enough food. In that environment, the brain that survived was the brain that assumed the worst. The human who heard that rustle and thought, probably just the wind, was occasionally right and eventually eaten. The human who heard that rustle and immediately flooded their body with adrenaline, ready to run or fight, that human survived. That human is your ancestor. You are the descendant of the most anxious, most threat-sensitive, most worst-case-assuming members of our species. That's not an insult. That's just history. The trouble is that this magnificent survival machinery doesn't come with an off switch, and it cannot tell the difference between a predator in the grass and a passive-aggressive Slack message. It responds to social rejection with the same basic alarm system it once used for physical danger. Because for most of human history, being rejected by your group wasn't just emotionally painful, it was a death sentence. You needed the tribe to survive. Exile meant exposure, starvation, predation. Your brain learned to treat social threat as existential threat, and it never unlearned that lesson. So what does this mean for you, practically, right now, in your actual life? It means that the mental software running your default responses was never designed for ambition. It was never designed for risk-taking, for building something new, for tolerating the discomfort of uncertainty in service of a long-term goal. It was designed for one thing only: keeping you alive long enough to reproduce, safe, comfortable, accepted by the group. That's the biological mandate your brain is still quietly, persistently executing every single day. And here's where it gets genuinely important. That mandate expresses itself in three specific ways that look completely reasonable on the surface, but are actively working against the life you're trying to build. The first is the comfort bias. Your brain will consistently, reliably, almost magnetically pull you toward familiar situations and away from uncertain ones. Not because familiar situations are better, but because they're known. The brain can model them. It knows the range of outcomes. Uncertainty, even uncertainty with enormous upside, triggers a low-grade alarm signal. This is why starting the business feels more frightening than staying in the job you've outgrown. Why the difficult conversation keeps getting postponed. Why the creative project that matters most to you keeps getting scheduled for later. Later is the comfort bias's favorite word. The second is the negativity filter. Your brain processes negative information faster, holds it longer, and weights it more heavily than positive information. Psychologists call this negativity bias, and it's not a character flaw. It's a calibration designed for survival. In a dangerous environment, missing a threat was fatal. Missing an opportunity was merely unfortunate. So your brain evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to what could go wrong and comparatively casual about what could go right. The consequence in modern life is that a single piece of critical feedback can outweigh a dozen genuine compliments. One bad day can color an otherwise good week. The mind reaches for problems the way a tongue reaches for a sore tooth. Automatically, repeatedly, almost without permission. The third is the belonging imperative. Humans are profoundly, biologically social. We needed groups to survive, and groups have always had rules, norms, hierarchies. The brain that stayed in the group's good graces was the brain that lived. So your nervous system is equipped with a powerful set of social monitoring systems that are running constantly in the background, scanning for signs of disapproval, tracking your standing relative to others, generating discomfort whenever you behave in ways that might make you conspicuous or controversial. Standing out from the crowd feels risky in a very old, very deep part of your brain, because for most of human history, it was. Now, Here's what I want you to actually take from all of this, because it would be easy to hear these three things and feel a kind of resigned hopelessness, as if you're a prisoner of your own neurology. You are not. The brain is not fixed. This is one of the most important things neuroscience has taught us in the last 30 years. The discovery that the brain retains its capacity for structural change throughout your entire life. Every time you think a thought, make a decision, practice a response, you are literally reshaping the physical architecture of your neural pathways. Some pathways get stronger through use. Others weaken through neglect. The brain you have right now is not the brain you were born with, and it is not the brain you are stuck with. What this means is that the default programming, the comfort bias, the negativity filter, the belonging imperative, these are not your permanent character. They are your starting point. The question is whether you're going to let them remain your operating system by default, or whether you're going to consciously install something better. Most people never do, not because they lack the intelligence or the desire, because they never understood that it was possible or that it was necessary. They assumed their reactions were their personality. They assumed their fears were their limits. They assumed the voice that says, "This probably won't work for someone like me," was telling the truth. That voice is not telling the truth. It's telling you survival math from 200,000 years ago, and the world has changed somewhat since then. There's a practical exercise I want to offer you here, and it's deceptively simple. For the next 3 days, whenever you notice yourself avoiding something, a task, a conversation, a decision, pause for just 5 seconds and ask a single question. Is this uncomfortable because it's genuinely dangerous, or because it's unfamiliar? That's it. Not a grand intervention. Just a 5-second pause and one honest question. Because most of the time, the answer will be unfamiliar. And that distinction between genuine danger and mere novelty is the first crack in the wall between where you are and where you're capable of going. You've been running old code. The upgrade starts with knowing that. Chapter 2. The beliefs that own you. There's a particular kind of conversation I find myself returning to again and again when I think about why intelligent, capable people stay stuck. It goes something like this. Someone tells you about a dream they have, a business, a creative project, a different kind of life. Their eyes light up when they describe it. The energy in their voice is real. And then, almost without pausing, they begin listing the reasons it won't work. The market is too crowded. The timing isn't right. They don't have the right background, the right connections, the right anything. By the end of the conversation, they've talked themselves completely out of it, and they look almost relieved. What just happened there? It wasn't logic. The reasons they listed weren't conclusions they reached through careful analysis. They were a defense, a rapid, automatic deployment of evidence in service of a verdict that had already been decided. The verdict wasn't, "This won't work." The verdict was, "This won't work for me." And that verdict didn't come from reason. It came from belief. Beliefs are the most powerful, invisible force in your life. More powerful than your circumstances. More powerful than your skills. More powerful, in many cases, than your actual effort. Because beliefs don't just influence what you do. They determine what you perceive. They act as a filter on reality itself, deciding which information reaches your conscious awareness and which gets quietly discarded before you ever notice it. This is not a metaphor. It's a function of a specific neurological system called the reticular activating system, a bundle of neurons in your brainstem that acts as a gatekeeper between the overwhelming flood of sensory information your environment produces and the narrow stream of information your conscious mind can actually process. Every second, your senses are absorbing roughly 11 million bits of information. Your conscious mind can handle somewhere around 50. The reticular activating system decides what makes the cut. And here's the critical part. It makes that decision based largely on what you already believe is important, relevant, or true. If you believe that opportunities for people like you are scarce, your reticular activating system will become extraordinarily efficient at finding evidence of scarcity and filtering out evidence of abundance. If you believe you're not creative, you will consistently fail to notice the moments when you actually are. Not because the evidence isn't there, because your brain has been instructed by your own beliefs not to let it through. This is why two people can walk through the same city, attend the same conference, work in the same industry, and come away with completely different pictures of what's possible. They're not seeing different things. They're running different filters. The most insidious thing about limiting beliefs is precisely how reasonable they feel. They don't announce themselves as beliefs. They present themselves as facts, as observations, as the plain, obvious truth about how things are. The person who believes they're not good with numbers doesn't experience that as a belief. They experience it as a self-evident reality confirmed by every math test they ever struggled through, every budget conversation that made them feel lost, every time a colleague seemed to grasp financial concepts faster than they did. What they almost never examine is the origin of that belief. Because if you trace almost any significant limiting belief back far enough, you find something surprisingly small at its root. A single comment from a teacher who was having a bad day. A failed exam taken during a period of genuine difficulty that got interpreted as permanent personal inadequacy. A parent who meant well but communicated worry in a way that landed as verdict. One moment, charged with emotion, in which a young mind made a quick decision about what this experience meant, and then spent the next several decades gathering evidence to confirm it. This is how beliefs are born, not through careful deliberation, through emotional intensity. The more charged the moment, the deeper the belief takes root, because emotion is the mechanism the brain uses to flag something as important enough to remember and act on. A mild inconvenience creates a mild preference. A humiliating experience creates a structural conviction that can last a lifetime. And here's what makes this particularly worth understanding. Beliefs don't just affect how you feel. They affect what you attempt. And what you attempt determines what you achieve. Which means a limiting belief, left unexamined, creates a self-fulfilling cycle so tight and so consistent that it eventually becomes genuinely indistinguishable from reality. The person who believes they can't build meaningful relationships avoids the vulnerable situations where deep connection forms, confirms through experience that they don't have meaningful relationships, and takes this as further proof that they simply aren't that kind of person. The belief created the behavior. The behavior created the outcome. The outcome confirmed the belief. Round and round, for years, sometimes decades, with no external force needed to keep the cycle spinning. It sustains itself. So how do you break it? The first step is the most underrated one. You have to actually look. Most people carry their beliefs the way they carry their keys, automatically, without awareness, until the moment something doesn't open. You need to develop the habit of examining your automatic thoughts, particularly the ones that arrive most quickly and feel most obviously true. Those are precisely the thoughts most likely to be operating from unexamined belief rather than genuine assessment. Pay attention to the language of your inner monologue when you face a challenge or consider a new direction. Listen for the constructions that signal belief masquerading as fact. I'm just not. I've never been good at. That kind of thing works for people who. The reality is, these phrases are red flags. They signal that a verdict has already been delivered, that you're no longer in the realm of assessment, but in the realm of identity. And identity, once crystallized around a limiting idea, becomes one of the most difficult things in the world to challenge. Because challenging it no longer feels like updating an opinion. It feels like a threat to who you are. Once you've identified a belief worth examining, the next step is to interrogate its origin. This isn't therapy, it's archaeology. You're not looking to process the emotion attached to the original experience. You're looking to find the moment where the interpretation was made, so you can question whether that interpretation was the only one available, or just the one that made sense to a younger version of you operating with limited information and significant emotional distress. A child told by a teacher that they have no artistic ability made a decision in that moment. But they made it at 7 years old, with a 7-year-old's understanding of what artistic ability means, what teachers know, what one person's opinion is worth, and what their own potential actually encompasses. That decision deserves to be revisited by the adult who has lived another 20 or 30 years and has considerably more data to work with. The question to ask is not, was this experience real? It was real. The question is, was the conclusion I drew from it the only possible conclusion, or just the most available one at the time? Almost always, it was just the most available one. After you've traced the belief and questioned its origin, the next stage is active replacement. And here I want to be careful, because this is where a lot of self-help advice goes wrong. The instruction to simply replace negative beliefs with positive ones produces people who repeat affirmations in the mirror without conviction and wonder why nothing changes. The reason nothing changes is that conviction isn't created by repetition alone. It's created by repetition combined with genuine emotional resonance and, critically, with actual evidence. New beliefs need support. They need proof, even small proof, that they're true. So rather than attempting a wholesale identity transplant, going from "I'm not creative" to "I am incredibly creative" in a single declaration, you build the new belief incrementally by deliberately accumulating evidence for it. You find one moment, however modest, where you did something creative. You hold that moment. You give it weight. Then you find another, and another. You begin actively tracking the data your existing filter has been discarding, not to lie to yourself about who you are, but to correct for the profound and systematic distortion that your existing belief has been applying to your experience all along. This process takes time. It takes more time than anyone wants it to. But here's what makes it worth every day of the effort. Beliefs exist in layers. There are surface beliefs, specific opinions about specific capabilities or situations. There are mid-level beliefs about your worth, your potential, your right to expect good things. And underneath everything, there are core beliefs about what the world is and what your place in it means. When you change a surface belief, you get a surface result. When you change a core belief, something else happens entirely. The surface beliefs begin to shift on their own. Your whole relationship with possibility starts to reorganize itself around the new foundation. It's not gradual improvement. It's structural renovation. I'll tell you something that I recognized about myself only after years of working on this. I used to carry a belief so core that I barely knew it was there, that visibility was dangerous, that being too successful, too confident, too conspicuous would invite criticism, rejection, resentment. I couldn't have articulated it clearly at the time, but it was running everything. Every time I had an opportunity to put myself forward, some part of me pulled back. Every time I was close to a breakthrough, I found ways to slow down. When I finally found that belief and looked at it clearly, when I traced it back to specific experiences and asked whether those experiences actually proved what I'd concluded they proved, it began to lose its grip. Not immediately, not completely painlessly, but permanently. That's what's available to you here. Not positive thinking, not a new personality, just the willingness to look at what's been running in the background, question whether it's accurate, and slowly, deliberately install something truer. Your beliefs were written by your past, but you are the only one with editing privileges. Chapter 3. Decisions are destiny, not drama. Here's something worth noticing about the way most people relate to their major life decisions. They treat them as events, dramatic, weighty, occasionally agonizing events that arrive at specific moments and demand resolution. The job offer, the relationship question, the city you move to, the project you commit to or walk away from. These feel like the decisions, capital T, capital D, the ones that matter, the ones that shape everything. And they do matter. But they're not actually where most of your destiny gets written. Your destiny gets written in the decisions so small you don't even recognize them as decisions. The moment you choose to scroll for another 20 minutes instead of working on the thing that could change your life. The meeting where you had something important to say and decided, in a fraction of a second, that this probably wasn't the right time. The book you almost bought. The call you nearly made. The version of yourself you almost let people see, before something pulled you back into the familiar, safer presentation. These micro-decisions accumulate with a mathematical precision that most people never account for. They compound. They create trajectories. And because they happen below the threshold of conscious deliberation, because they feel too small to be significant, they rarely get examined. They just happen, day after day, quietly steering the ship. The uncomfortable reality is this. Most people spend more cognitive energy choosing a restaurant than they spend examining the decision frameworks that govern the most consequential choices of their lives. They have elaborate opinions about which streaming shows deserve their time. They have almost no language for how they actually make decisions about their careers, their relationships, their money, their futures. This isn't stupidity. It's the natural result of a culture that teaches outcomes but never teaches the process of choosing. We celebrate good results and mourn bad ones, but spend almost no time examining the quality of the thinking that produced them. So most people inherit their decision-making approach from a combination of instinct, imitation, and emotional momentum, and then wonder why their results feel so random. Decision-making quality is a skill. Like any skill, it can be studied, practiced, and systematically improved. And like any skill, small improvements in it, compounded over time, produce outcomes that look almost miraculous to people who haven't examined the underlying process. The person who consistently makes slightly better decisions than everyone around them doesn't just get slightly better results. Over years, over decades, they end up in an entirely different category of life. Same starting conditions, radically different destinations. So let's talk about how decisions actually work and where the most common failures happen. The first and most fundamental failure is the absence of clarity about what you're actually optimizing for. This sounds obvious until you examine it honestly. Most people, when pressed, cannot clearly articulate what they are trying to create with their lives at this specific stage. They have vague directional preferences: more financial security, better relationships, more meaningful work. But they haven't translated those preferences into specific, ordered priorities that can actually guide decision-making in real time. The consequence is that they make decisions by feel, by what seems most urgent in the moment, by what generates the least immediate discomfort, by what other people around them appear to be doing. These are not completely useless inputs, but they are not a decision-making system. They're a collection of emotional reflexes dressed up as choices, and without a clear framework for what you're optimizing for, every decision becomes a guessing game played under social and emotional pressure. Before any significant decision, the most important question is not "what should I do?" It's "what am I actually trying to create here, and over what time horizon?" That question reframes everything. It shifts you from reacting to a situation to deliberately navigating toward a destination. It activates a completely different quality of thinking: slower, more spacious, less hijacked by what feels immediately urgent or emotionally charged. The second common failure is thinking in only one dimension of time. Most decisions have at least 3 relevant time horizons. What happens immediately? What trajectory does this choice put me on over months and years? And what does choosing this option cost me in terms of other paths I'm foreclosing? That third dimension, opportunity cost, is the one most consistently ignored. Every yes is a collection of invisible no's. When you say yes to a certain job, you're saying no to developing the skills you'd build somewhere else, to the relationships you'd form in a different environment, to the version of yourself that would have emerged from a different set of challenges. When you say yes to spending your evenings a certain way, you're saying no to everything else that time could have built. None of this means every opportunity cost is worth agonizing over. It means that serious decisions deserve to be evaluated with explicit attention to what they foreclose, not just what they offer. The question, "What am I gaining?" needs its counterpart. What am I permanently or temporarily trading away? The third failure is conflating risk avoidance with safety. These are not the same thing, and confusing them is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make across a lifetime of choices. Genuine safety sometimes requires taking risks. Staying in a career that's slowly eroding your confidence and skills feels safe because it's known, because it provides a predictable income, because it doesn't require you to face the possibility of public failure. But over 5 years, over 10, the cost of that apparent safety compounds in ways that become very difficult to reverse. Skills atrophy, confidence erodes. The gap between who you are and who you could have been widens. The risk of stagnation is just as real as the risk of failure. It's simply slower and quieter, which makes it far easier to ignore until the damage is substantial. High-quality decision-makers distinguish between 2 kinds of risk. There's the risk of action, the possibility that something you try will fail in a visible, measurable way. And there's the risk of inaction, the possibility that not trying will cost you something that never announces itself loudly, but accumulates in the background over years. Most people systematically overweight the first kind of risk and systematically underweight the second, because failure from action is concrete and immediate, while failure from inaction is diffuse and slow. There's a framework I find genuinely useful here, though I want to offer it as a tool rather than a formula. When facing any significant decision, run it through 3 filters in sequence. The first filter is reversibility. Is this decision reversible or essentially permanent? A reversible decision with moderate stakes deserves relatively quick, decisive action, because the cost of a wrong choice is bounded, and the cost of overthinking is real. An essentially irreversible decision with high stakes deserves extended, careful consideration, because the asymmetry of outcomes justifies the investment of time. Most people apply the same amount of deliberation to both categories, which means they're chronically overthinking the reversible and underthinking the permanent. The second filter is what I'd call trajectory over snapshot. Instead of asking, "Is this good right now?" ask, "Where does this path lead if I follow it for 3 years, for 5 years?" Many choices that look attractive in the snapshot look quite different when you extend the time horizon, and many choices that seem costly or uncomfortable right now look like clear investments when you imagine the person you'd become by following them through. The third filter is the regret minimization test, a concept I first encountered through Jeff Bezos, but which has roots in much older thinking. The question is simple. When you're much older, looking back at this period of your life, which choice will you regret more? Most people on their deathbeds don't regret the things they tried and failed at. They regret the things they never tried. They regret the versions of themselves they never gave permission to exist. The regret minimization frame doesn't make decisions for you, but it often cuts through the noise of short-term anxiety to reveal what you actually value most. Now, I want to say something about the relationship between analysis and action, because there's a trap on this side of the conversation too. Everything I've described above can become, in the wrong hands, a sophisticated justification for never deciding anything, for endlessly refining the framework, researching the options, waiting for more information, more certainty, more readiness. Analysis is useful. Analysis without a terminus is paralysis wearing the costume of wisdom. The best decision-makers I've observed share a particular quality that doesn't get talked about enough. They're comfortable with the permanent incompleteness of information. They understand that you will never have all the data, never achieve full certainty, never arrive at the moment when the decision feels entirely safe. That moment doesn't exist, and waiting for it doesn't protect you from risk. It just slowly transfers your choices to circumstances and other people. There is a version of decisiveness that's reckless, the impulsive leap that ignores available information and reasonable analysis. But there's another version that's something close to courage, the ability to reach a genuinely good decision with genuinely incomplete information and then commit to it fully enough to give it a real chance of working. That second version is far rarer and far more valuable. One more thing about decisions that I think matters enormously. The quality of your decisions is inseparable from the quality of your mental state at the moment you make them. Decisions made from anxiety tend to optimize for reducing anxiety rather than for genuine long-term benefit. Decisions made from ego tend to optimize for what will look good to others rather than for what actually serves you. Decisions made from fatigue, from hunger, from the end of a long day when your prefrontal cortex is depleted. These decisions consistently underperform compared to the same person making the same decision under better conditions. This means that part of being a better decision maker is managing the conditions under which you make decisions. Protecting your most cognitively clear hours for your most important choices. Not making significant decisions while emotionally flooded. Building deliberate space, even a day, even just a night's sleep, between the moment of pressure and the moment of commitment on anything that genuinely matters. The quality of your choices is the quality of your life. Not because individual decisions are always pivotal, but because aggregated across years, the cumulative weight of how you decide, with what clarity, what self-knowledge, what honest accounting of cost and consequence, that weight shapes everything. The career you end up in, the relationships that sustain you or drain you, the person you gradually, quietly become. Decisions are not dramatic. They are daily, and daily, practiced with even modest intention, they become the most powerful force in your life that you actually control. Chapter 4. The gift hidden inside pressure. There's a metallurgical fact that I find myself thinking about more than seems reasonable for someone who knows almost nothing about metalworking. When iron is heated to extreme temperatures and subjected to repeated hammering, something happens at the molecular level. The internal structure of the metal reorganizes. Impurities get driven out. The grain of the metal tightens and aligns. What emerges from that process is steel, harder, more flexible, more durable than anything that could have been produced by simply leaving the iron alone and hoping for the best. The iron doesn't choose to become steel, but you can. We live in a culture that has developed a sophisticated and deeply unhealthy relationship with difficulty. We treat hardship as a malfunction, as evidence that something has gone wrong, that the universe has made an error, that we are somehow owed a smoother path than the one we're on. The self-help industry has, in many ways, made this worse, offering the implicit promise that the right techniques, the right mindset, the right morning routine will eventually produce a life largely free from friction, from failure, from the grinding, unglamorous difficulty of trying to build something real. That promise is a lie, and believing it doesn't just set you up for disappointment, it actively undermines your capacity to handle the challenges that are, without any exception, coming for you regardless. Here's what the research actually shows. Across fields as different as immunology, sports science, cognitive psychology, and organizational behavior, systems that are protected from all stress do not thrive. They atrophy. They become fragile in the precise proportion to which they've been shielded from challenge. Your immune system doesn't strengthen by avoiding all pathogens. It strengthens by encountering them, responding to them, and building the specific antibodies that future encounters will require. Your muscles don't grow by being rested. They grow by being stressed to the point of microscopic damage, then repaired stronger than before. Your mind works on the same principle, not as a metaphor, as a literal neurological reality. The question, then, is not whether you'll face difficulty. The question is whether you'll face it with a mind that's been trained to extract value from it, or a mind that's been trained to avoid it at all costs. Because those two minds, given identical external challenges, will produce radically different outcomes. Not because the challenges are different, because the relationship to challenge is different. Let me describe what that relationship actually looks like in practice, because I think the concept gets discussed too abstractly. Most people, when they encounter a significant obstacle, move through a predictable internal sequence. There's the initial impact, the moment of shock or frustration or fear. Then there's the interpretation phase, which happens faster than most people realize, often within seconds. And it's in that interpretation phase that the critical fork appears. One path asks, "Why is this happening to me?" The other asks, "What is this asking of me?" Those two questions sound similar. They are not. The first locates agency outside you, in circumstances, in bad luck, in other people's failures. It positions you as a recipient of events rather than a participant in them. The second locates agency inside you, in your capacity to respond, adapt, learn, and ultimately use whatever this situation contains. It positions you as someone who acts on events rather than being acted upon by them. I want to be careful here, because there's a version of this idea that becomes toxic. The version that says you should be grateful for every difficulty, that suffering is always a gift, that there's a silver lining in everything if you just look hard enough. That version asks you to perform positivity in the face of genuine pain, and it's both psychologically dishonest and ultimately counterproductive. You're allowed to find certain things genuinely hard. You're allowed to grieve real losses. You're allowed to acknowledge when something is unfair. What you're not well served by is staying in that acknowledgement as a permanent residence. The question isn't whether the difficulty is real, it's what you're going to do with it. The concept I find most useful here comes from the work of Nassim Taleb, who distinguishes between things that are fragile, harmed by disorder, things that are robust, unaffected by disorder, and things that are anti-fragile, which actually gain from disorder. Most people aim for robustness. They want to be the kind of person who can take a hit and remain standing. That's admirable, but it's not the ceiling. The ceiling is anti-fragility, becoming genuinely stronger, more capable, more resourceful as a direct result of encountering adversity. Not despite it, because of it. The anti-fragile mind doesn't just recover from setbacks, it mines them. Every failure yields specific information about what didn't work and therefore about what might. Every rejection clarifies something about the gap between your current capabilities and the standard you're reaching for. Every period of genuine struggle builds a kind of neural and psychological infrastructure that simply cannot be constructed any other way. A reservoir of demonstrated resilience that becomes the foundation of genuine self-confidence. Notice I said genuine self-confidence, not the performed kind, the kind that collapses the moment real difficulty arrives because it was never tested. The kind that only exists in the absence of challenge. Real confidence is almost always built on a history of difficulty navigated. It has scar tissue in it. It knows what it's made of because it's been tested and found sufficient. This is why people who have overcome significant adversity often possess a quality of groundedness that people with uniformly smooth lives struggle to access. It's not that suffering ennobles automatically. It doesn't. Unprocessed suffering just creates damage. But suffering that's been worked through, examined, and integrated builds something that ease simply cannot. So how do you actually develop this relationship with difficulty? How do you move from intellectually accepting the idea that challenges are useful to viscerally, behaviorally treating them that way when you're in the middle of one? The first shift is in what you practice seeking out. Most people, when given a choice, gravitate towards situations that confirm their competence. Projects they know they can handle. Conversations they know they can navigate. Environments where their existing skills are sufficient. This feels productive. You're getting things done, you're succeeding, but it's actually a form of sophisticated stagnation. You're not growing. You're demonstrating what you've already grown. The anti-fragile approach is to deliberately and regularly seek out situations that are slightly beyond your current competence. Not recklessly, not in ways where failure has catastrophic, irreversible consequences, but in ways where failure is genuinely possible, where you will be required to develop capabilities you don't currently have, where the outcome is uncertain enough to be interesting. This is where actual growth happens. Always at the edge of your current capacity, never comfortably inside it. The second shift is in how you process failure when it comes, and it will come, even if you do everything right. Even if you're talented and hardworking and thoughtful, failure is not an aberration in the life of someone who's genuinely attempting something. It's a recurring feature. The question is whether you process each failure as data or as verdict. Data is specific, temporary, and actionable. This approach didn't work in this context under these conditions. Verdict is general, permanent, and paralyzing. I'm not capable of this. I'm not the kind of person who succeeds at things like this. The difference between those two ways of processing the same event is the difference between a temporary setback and a permanent limitation. There's a concept from cognitive psychology called explanatory style, the habitual way you explain negative events to yourself. Research by Martin Seligman and others found that people who explain setbacks as personal, permanent, and pervasive. This happened because of something fundamental about me. It always happens to me, and it affects everything in my life. Consistently underperform and struggle with resilience. People who explain the same setbacks as contextual, temporary, and specific. This particular approach didn't work in this particular situation right now. Show dramatically greater resilience and, over time, greater achievement. This isn't wishful thinking. It's accurate thinking. Because the personal, permanent, pervasive interpretation is almost always less accurate than the contextual, temporary, specific one. Most failures are not caused purely by who you are. They're caused by a combination of factors, many of which are external, circumstantial, and changeable. The person who sees this clearly isn't being optimistic. They're being precise. The third shift, and this one is subtle but important, is in your relationship with discomfort as a signal. Most of us have been trained, consciously and unconsciously, to treat discomfort as a stop sign, as a signal that something is wrong, that you should back off, that relief should be pursued immediately. But if you're growing, if you're genuinely pushing beyond your current capabilities, discomfort is not a stop sign. It's a marker. It marks the boundary between what you already know how to do and what you're in the process of learning. The discomfort of a difficult conversation is the marker of a relationship growing in depth and honesty. The discomfort of learning a new skill is the marker of capability expanding. The discomfort of sitting with uncertainty without immediately reaching for resolution is the marker of a more mature and powerful relationship with reality developing. In each case, the discomfort is not telling you to stop. It's telling you that you're in the right place, doing the right kind of work. This reframe doesn't make the discomfort disappear. It changes what the discomfort means. And what something means determines everything about how you relate to it. I want to leave you with something concrete here. Think of the last time you faced a genuine difficulty, something that cost you, something that didn't go the way you needed it to. Now ask yourself honestly, what specific capability did navigating that situation require you to develop? What did you understand after it that you couldn't have understood before? What did it prove to you about yourself that easier circumstances never could have? If you can answer those questions, if you can find the specific value that difficulty produced, you've done something most people never do. You've made the experience work for you rather than simply against you. You've taken the iron and begun the process of making steel. Difficulty is not the interruption of your story. In most of the best stories, it is the story. The question is only whether you're reading it as a tragedy or as training. Chapter 5. Performing when you don't feel like it. There's a fantasy that almost everyone who wants to achieve something significant carries around quietly. It's the fantasy of permanent motivation. The idea that somewhere on the other side of the right book, the right conversation, the right moment of clarity, there exists a version of you who is consistently, reliably, deeply motivated to do the work. A version who wakes up energized every morning, who never stares at the task and feels nothing, who doesn't need to negotiate with themselves to begin. That version of you does not exist, has never existed, will never exist. And the sooner you stop waiting for them to arrive, the sooner your actual life can begin. Motivation is not a character trait. It's a neurochemical event. It's driven largely by dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated not primarily with pleasure, as most people believe, but with anticipation, with the expectation of reward. Motivation feels strong when the reward feels near, vivid, and certain. It feels weak when the reward is distant, abstract, or uncertain, which means that for almost any meaningful long-term goal, building a business, developing a skill, creating something of genuine value, motivation will be a consistently unreliable companion. Because meaningful goals are almost always distant, frequently abstract, and never entirely certain. This is not a personal failing. It's basic neuroscience applied to the structure of ambitious endeavors. The people who consistently produce results over long periods of time have not solved the motivation problem. They've bypassed it. They've built their productive lives on a foundation that doesn't require motivation to function. A foundation of systems, habits, structures, and identity that operates whether motivation shows up or not. Think about what this means in practice. A surgeon doesn't assess their motivation before an operation. A pilot doesn't decide whether they feel like executing the pre-flight checklist based on how inspired they are that morning. A professional musician doesn't wait for the muse to descend before they practice their scales. In each case, the performance happens not because the emotional conditions are perfect, but because the commitment is structural. It's been decided in advance, embedded in routine, supported by professional identity in a way that makes not doing it the exception requiring justification rather than the norm. This is the model. Not the motivated amateur who produces brilliantly when the stars align and inconsistently when they don't. The professional who produces consistently, regardless, not because they feel more than the amateur, but because they've built a relationship with their work that doesn't depend on feeling. Now, I want to be careful about something here, because there's a version of this conversation that becomes brutal and counterproductive. The version that says feelings are irrelevant, that discipline is everything, that you should simply override your emotional state through sheer willpower and grind, regardless of what's happening inside you. That version is both psychologically naive and practically ineffective. Chronic willpower depletion is real. Ignoring your internal state entirely produces a kind of mechanical productivity that is both unsustainable and ultimately not that productive. Because some of the most important work requires genuine engagement, not just physical presence. The more accurate model is this. You don't wait for motivation, but you also don't ignore your inner state. You develop a sophisticated relationship with both, learning to act in the absence of motivation while also learning to manage your energy, attention, and emotional state in ways that make consistent performance not just possible, but increasingly natural. Let's start with the structural side, because this is where most people need to begin. The single most important structural principle for consistent performance is what behavioral scientists call friction reduction. The basic insight is straightforward, but its implications are profound. Human behavior is exquisitely sensitive to ease. We consistently choose the easier path, the more accessible option, the lower friction alternative, not because we're lazy, but because our brains are efficiency-optimizing machines that conserve energy wherever possible. This means that designing your environment for the behavior you want is not a nice addition to your system. It's the system. If you want to write consistently, the document should already be open when you sit down. If you want to exercise regularly, the clothes should be laid out the night before. The route should be planned. The time should be blocked and treated as non-negotiable. If you want to spend less time on distraction, the phone should be in another room during your working hours, not on your desk where its mere presence, research shows, occupies a portion of your cognitive bandwidth even when you're not looking at it. Each of these adjustments seems trivially small. That's the point. You're not trying to generate heroic willpower. You're trying to make the desired behavior so frictionless and the undesired behavior so comparatively effortful that the choice becomes almost automatic. You're using the brain's own efficiency bias in service of your goals rather than against them. The counterpart to friction reduction is friction addition, deliberately making undesired behaviors more effortful. Delete the social media apps from your phone and access them only through the browser. Put your television remote in a drawer across the room. Move the unhealthy food to the back of a high shelf. None of these changes make the undesired behavior impossible. They make it require one additional decision, one additional moment of intentional choice. And that one additional moment is often enough to interrupt the automatic pattern and give your prefrontal cortex a chance to weigh in. Environmental design is so powerful precisely because it operates beneath the level of motivation. You don't need to feel like making good choices. You've already made the environment make good choices the easier option. Now let's talk about the internal side, because structural support is necessary but not sufficient. There's still the moment of beginning, the moment when the task is in front of you and your body and mind are offering various creative arguments for why now is not quite the right time. The most useful thing I've found for this moment is deceptively simple. You don't try to feel ready. You accept that you won't feel ready, and you start anyway, with the smallest possible version of starting. Not, I will now write the chapter, but I will write the first sentence. Not, I will now complete the workout, but I will put on my shoes and begin. Not, I will now tackle the difficult conversation, but I will send the message that opens it. The research on this is consistent. Motivation follows action far more reliably than action follows motivation. The emotional state you're waiting to feel before you begin is far more likely to arrive after you've already started than before. This is sometimes called the action-motivation loop. Action generates momentum, momentum generates engagement, engagement generates something that functions very much like motivation, which generates more action. But you have to prime the pump. You have to break the inertia with something small enough that your resistance doesn't bother to organize against it. The writer who sits down and commits only to writing badly for 15 minutes almost always ends up writing for 2 hours. The runner who commits only to 5 minutes almost always ends up running the full route. Not because they tricked themselves, but because starting genuinely changes the internal landscape. The task that felt enormous from the outside feels manageable once you're inside it. There's another layer here that doesn't get discussed enough, and it has to do with identity rather than behavior. The most durable form of consistent performance isn't produced by discipline or habit alone. It's produced by a shift in how you see yourself. A shift from someone who is trying to do this to someone who does this. This distinction is more profound than it sounds. When your behavior is attached to an external goal, I exercise to lose weight. I work on my business to make money. The behavior is only as stable as the goal feels relevant. When the goal feels distant, when progress is slow, when other priorities press in, the behavior wobbles. But when your behavior is attached to identity, I'm someone who takes their physical health seriously. I'm someone who builds things. The behavior becomes self-sustaining in a completely different way, because now not doing it isn't just failing to make progress toward an external target. It's acting inconsistently with who you are. And that's a different kind of discomfort entirely, one most people are highly motivated to avoid. Identity-based performance is built through accumulation. Every time you follow through on a commitment you made to yourself, you cast a small vote for a particular identity. Every time you don't, you cast a vote against it. No single vote decides the election, but over time, over hundreds and thousands of small moments of follow-through or abandonment, an identity crystallizes. It becomes the thing you reach for when someone asks who you are. And once it does, consistency becomes not the heroic exception, but the natural expression of self. I want to address something here that I think deserves more honesty than it usually gets. There will be days when you genuinely cannot perform at your normal level. Days when something is happening in your life, grief, illness, profound uncertainty, emotional depletion, that makes your usual standard of output genuinely inaccessible. On those days, the right response is not grinding through regardless. That path leads to a kind of damage that is both real and slow accumulating. The right response is to maintain the practice at whatever reduced level is genuinely sustainable. Doing something, however small, rather than nothing. Not because output matters on those days. Because continuity matters. Because the identity of someone who shows up, even when showing up means a fraction of normal, is more valuable and more durable than the identity of someone who produces brilliantly in ideal conditions and disappears when conditions deteriorate. Show up small. The size matters far less than the showing up. There's a concept in music that I find unexpectedly useful here. Professional musicians talk about the difference between practicing and playing. Playing is expressive, spontaneous, connected to feeling. It requires a certain internal state to do well. Practicing is different. Practicing is systematic, repetitive, deliberate. You do it in the absence of inspiration precisely to build the technical foundation that makes inspired playing possible when inspiration does arrive. Your life works the same way. The daily practice, the consistent, unsexy, unglamorous maintenance of the habits and systems and commitments that form your foundation, that's the practicing. The moments of genuine flow, real creativity, peak performance, those are the playing. And the playing is only possible because of the practicing. You can't skip the practicing and still access the playing. The inspiration has nowhere to land if there's no structure beneath it. Do the practice. Every day, especially the days when you don't feel like it. Those are, in fact, the most important days of all. Chapter 6. The maps inside your head. Every decision you've ever made was guided by a map. Not a physical one, a mental one. A model of how the world works, how people behave, how causes produce effects. You didn't choose most of these maps consciously. They assembled themselves from experience, education, and observation, quietly becoming the lens through which you interpret everything. The problem isn't having mental maps. You can't function without them. The problem is forgetting that maps are not the territory. Every map is a simplification. Every model leaves things out. And the more confidently you navigate by an incomplete map, the more catastrophically you can get lost. Here's a story that makes this uncomfortably concrete. In colonial India, the British administration was troubled by a large cobra population in Delhi. Their solution seemed elegant: offer a bounty for every dead cobra brought in. Initially, it worked perfectly. Cobra carcasses arrived in volume, payments went out, and administrators congratulated themselves on a well-designed policy. What they didn't model was human ingenuity in the presence of financial incentive. Enterprising locals began breeding cobras specifically to claim the bounty. When the administration discovered this and canceled the program, the breeders released their now worthless inventory into the streets. The cobra population ended up larger than before the policy began. The administrators weren't stupid. They were operating from an incomplete map, one that modeled first-order effects but not second-order ones. What happens immediately versus what happens in response to what happens immediately. This gap between first and second-order thinking is where enormous amounts of human error live, in policy, in business, in personal decisions made every day. Second-order thinking asks a simple but demanding question, and then what? You lower your prices to attract more customers, and then what? Competitors match you, margins collapse. A price war begins that leaves everyone worse off than before. You avoid a difficult conversation to preserve short-term peace, and then what? The unspoken tension compounds, resentment calcifies, the relationship slowly hollows out. The first-order outcome looked desirable. The second-order outcome was the opposite of the intention, training yourself to ask, and then what? Habitually, before committing to significant decisions, is one of the highest leverage mental habits available to you. It's not complicated. It just requires the discipline to pause long enough to run the scenario one step further than feels immediately necessary. Another map worth deliberately installing is systems thinking. The ability to see not just events, but the structures that produce events. Most people, when something goes wrong, look for the nearest visible cause and address that. Systems thinkers look for the structural conditions that made that outcome predictable, because they understand that treating symptoms while leaving structures intact just produces the same symptoms again, often in a slightly different form. If your team keeps missing deadlines, the surface cause might be poor time management. The system's cause might be that your planning process consistently underestimates complexity, or that your culture makes it socially costly to raise concerns early. Fix the surface, the problem returns. Fix the structure, the problem disappears. There's also probabilistic thinking, perhaps the most practically valuable mental model for navigating a world that is irreducibly uncertain. Most people think in certainties. This will work. That won't. He's trustworthy. She isn't. Binary assessments applied to a world that operates in probabilities and distributions. The consequence is that unexpected outcomes, which are actually just low-probability events that occurred, feel like betrayals of reality rather than natural features of it. Thinking probabilistically means holding multiple possible outcomes simultaneously, assigning rough likelihoods, and making decisions based on expected value rather than best-case hope or worst-case fear. It means accepting that a good decision can produce a bad outcome, and a bad decision can produce a good outcome, and that the quality of the decision should be judged by the reasoning process rather than the result alone. These maps, second-order thinking, systems thinking, probabilistic thinking, are not complicated once you understand them. But they require something most people resist: slowing down the moment of interpretation, sitting with a situation slightly longer than feels comfortable before reaching for the nearest available explanation. The quality of your maps determines the quality of your navigation, and here's the quietly radical implication of that. Two people with identical information, identical intelligence, and identical effort will reach dramatically different destinations if one is navigating with richer, more accurate mental models than the other. You don't need to know more than everyone else. You need to think about what you know more clearly. Update your maps. Question them regularly. And never mistake the map for the territory it's trying to describe. Chapter 7. Mastering the storm inside. There's a gap that most people never learn to use. It exists between the moment something happens and the moment you respond to it. For most people, in most charged situations, that gap is effectively zero. The trigger arrives, and the reaction follows so quickly, it feels like a single event. Someone criticizes your work, and you're defensive before you've finished hearing the sentence. The project falls apart, and you're catastrophizing before you've assessed the actual damage. The email arrives with bad news, and your body is already in emergency mode before your mind has read past the first line. That gap, that space between stimulus and response, is where your entire emotional life either gets decided for you or gets chosen by you. Learning to find it and then to use it is one of the most consequential skills a person can develop. Here's what's actually happening in your brain during intense emotional moments. The amygdala, an almond-shaped structure deep in your brain's limbic system, processes emotional information faster than your prefrontal cortex can evaluate it. When it detects something threatening, it can trigger a full stress response before your rational mind has had any meaningful input. Adrenaline and cortisol flood your system. Heart rate climbs. Muscle tension increases. Complex thinking narrows. You become faster and stronger and considerably less wise, all within milliseconds. This system was genuinely life-saving for most of human history. In a world of physical threats, a brain that waited for full rational deliberation before responding was a brain that got its owner killed. Speed mattered more than accuracy. But in a world where most threats are social, professional, and relational, that same speed produces the email you regret sending, the conversation that damages a relationship, the decision made from fear that costs you something you can't easily recover. The physiological reality is that once stress hormones are in your bloodstream, they take several minutes to clear, even after the trigger has passed. This means that decisions made in the immediate aftermath of an emotional trigger are being made in a chemically altered state, regardless of how calm you believe yourself to be. Understanding this isn't an excuse. It's a timing guide. Wait. Not forever. Just long enough for the chemistry to shift. Practically, this means developing what I'd call early warning literacy. The ability to recognize the physical signals that emotional intensity is building before it reaches the point of hijacking. For most people, there are consistent, identifiable precursors: a specific quality of tension in the jaw or shoulders, a change in breathing pattern, a narrowing of attention, a particular quality of thought that begins to loop. These signals arrive before the full emotional flood. They are your window. When you notice them, the single most effective immediate intervention is physiological. Slow, deliberate breathing, specifically extending the exhale longer than the inhale, directly activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which counteracts the stress response at the chemical level. This isn't relaxation advice. It's neuroscience. 6 slow breaths, with the exhale running slightly longer than the inhale, measurably changes your hormonal environment within minutes. Beyond the immediate, there's the broader practice of cognitive reappraisal, changing not what you feel, but what you make events mean, which changes what you feel. The high-stakes presentation reframed from a situation where I might fail publicly to an opportunity to demonstrate what I've built. The difficult feedback reframed from an attack on my competence to specific information I can use. Not denial, not performance. A genuine alternative interpretation that opens different emotional and behavioral possibilities. The deepest form of emotional mastery, though, is simpler and harder than any technique. It's developing the capacity to feel something fully without immediately needing to act on it. To be angry without needing to express the anger right now. To be afraid without needing to escape the fear immediately. To sit inside discomfort long enough to respond thoughtfully rather than react automatically. Emotions are information. They deserve to be heard. They do not always deserve to be obeyed. The gap between trigger and response is always there. Most people just move through it too fast to notice. Slow down. That gap is where your best self lives. Chapter 8. The power of small, relentless motion. There's a particular kind of frustration that serious, ambitious people know intimately. It's the frustration of working hard, genuinely hard, and feeling like the results don't reflect the effort. Like you're pushing against something that isn't quite moving. Like the distance between where you are and where you want to be isn't closing fast enough to justify the energy you're spending. That frustration almost always comes from the same source: intensity without consistency, the approach of doing a great deal occasionally, rather than doing something small every single day. We are culturally obsessed with intensity, with the dramatic effort, the all-nighter, the massive push, the transformation that happens over a single extraordinary weekend. These stories are compelling because they're visible. You can photograph intensity, you can narrate it, it makes for good content. What makes for a good life is considerably less photogenic. It's the quiet, unglamorous accumulation of small, consistent actions that individually seem almost meaningless, but collectively become unstoppable. Consider the mathematics of compounding, not with money but with capability. If you improve at something by just 1% each day, after 1 year you are not 1% better. You are 37 times better. 37 times. From 1% daily. The numbers feel impossible until you understand that compound growth isn't linear. It curves. Slowly at first, then steeply, then almost vertically. The beginning looks like nothing. The end looks like everything. And most people quit somewhere in the middle. During the long flat section, where effort is real but visible results are modest, concluding that the approach isn't working precisely when it's about to begin working dramatically. This is the single most common and most costly mistake in long-term development. Abandoning a compounding system during the phase where compound growth hasn't yet become visible. The solution isn't more intensity during those flat periods. It's a different relationship with progress itself, one that measures consistency rather than outcome, leading indicators rather than lagging ones. You can control whether you showed up today. You cannot directly control whether today's showing up produced visible results. Tracking the former rather than obsessing over the latter keeps you anchored to what's actually within your power. Practically, this means building what I'd call minimum viable habits, the smallest version of a practice that maintains continuity without requiring heroic willpower to sustain. Not an hour of writing daily, but 300 words. Not a 90-minute workout, but 20 minutes of movement. Not a comprehensive weekly review, but 5 minutes of honest reflection before sleep. These minimums feel embarrassingly small when you set them. That's precisely the point. You're not trying to impress yourself with ambition. You're trying to build something that doesn't break under the normal pressure of a real, complicated life. Because here's what happens to ambitious systems built on intensity. Life intervenes. A difficult week arrives. A personal crisis demands attention. Energy drops for reasons entirely outside your control. And the system that required sustained high motivation collapses, because the motivational conditions that built it no longer exist. Then comes the guilt, the loss of identity continuity, the cold restart that requires rebuilding momentum from zero. The minimum viable habit survives these periods. Even on the hardest weeks, 300 words is findable. 20 minutes of movement is findable. 5 minutes of reflection is findable. Continuity is maintained. Identity is preserved. And when conditions improve, the system expands naturally, not through a dramatic recommitment, but through the simple organic increase of someone who never actually stopped. Systems also need feedback. Not the vague internal sense of whether you're doing well, but actual measurement of actual leading indicators. What gets measured doesn't just get managed. It becomes real in a way that unmeasured things never quite do. A simple daily record of whether you showed up, what you did, how long you spent. This transforms abstract intention into concrete accountability. It also reveals patterns invisible to casual observation. The days you consistently skip, the conditions that reliably derail you, the practices that produce downstream effects in energy and clarity, and the practices that quietly drain them. Review that record weekly, not to judge yourself, but to understand yourself, to notice what's working and adjust what isn't with the same practical neutrality a farmer brings to reading weather patterns. No drama, just information, applied, small, consistent, measured, reviewed. These 4 words describe almost every meaningful transformation I've ever observed across years of watching people build things that last. Not the dramatic sprint, not the heroic effort, the quiet daily motion, sustained long past the point where most people have given up or moved on to something newer and more exciting. The most powerful force in your development isn't how hard you can push, it's how long you can keep moving. Chapter 9. The social game no one taught you. Most of us were taught, implicitly or explicitly, that success is fundamentally an individual project. That what matters is your talent, your work ethic, your ideas, your execution. Other people feature in this story primarily as an audience, as people who will eventually recognize and reward the quality of your individual effort. This model is not just incomplete, it's quietly devastating to the careers and ambitions of enormously talented people who never understand why their excellence isn't translating into the outcomes they expected. No meaningful achievement exists in isolation. Every significant thing humans have built, created, or changed has involved a complex web of relationships, of trust earned slowly, value exchanged genuinely, influence developed through consistent demonstration rather than clever persuasion. The person who understands this doesn't just perform better individually. They multiply their effective capacity by gaining access to other people's knowledge, resources, networks, and goodwill. They become, in the most literal sense, larger than themselves. The fundamental misunderstanding most people carry about social influence is that it's primarily about communication, about saying the right things in the right way. It isn't. It's primarily about understanding, about developing a genuinely accurate model of what the person across from you actually cares about, fears, wants, and needs, and then finding authentic ways to connect your objectives with theirs. This requires something that sounds simple and proves consistently difficult. You have to be more interested in other people than most people are comfortable being. Not performatively interested, people detect performed interest immediately, and it produces the opposite of rapport. Genuinely curious about their experience, their perspective, their particular way of navigating the world. The person who walks into every interaction primarily broadcasting their own value, their own story, their own agenda, will consistently underperform the person who walks in primarily listening. Here's something slightly uncomfortable but immediately recognizable as true. Most people in most conversations are not really listening. They're waiting for their turn to speak, to respond, to redirect the conversation toward their own experience or opinion. The person who actually listens, who asks genuine follow-up questions, who sits with what they've heard long enough to respond to what was actually said, rather than what they expected to hear. That person is so rare that they are almost immediately experienced as extraordinary. Listening is not passive. It's one of the most active and powerful things you can do in a social interaction. Beyond listening, the currency of genuine influence is value delivered without immediate expectation of return. Reciprocity is one of the most robust findings in social psychology. People feel a powerful impulse to return genuine generosity. But the key word is genuine. Generosity deployed strategically with a visible transactional agenda doesn't trigger reciprocity. It triggers wariness. People can feel the difference between someone who helps them because they see an opportunity to create obligation and someone who helps them because they actually care about their situation. The latter is what builds relationship capital, a form of accumulated trust and goodwill that becomes extraordinarily valuable over time precisely because it can't be manufactured quickly. It can only be built through consistent, patient demonstration that you are someone who delivers value without always keeping score. There's also the matter of credibility, the foundation beneath all influence. Credibility isn't claimed through self-promotion. It's conferred through demonstrated reliability over time. Following through on small commitments, being accurate about what you know and honest about what you don't, taking responsibility for outcomes rather than deflecting toward circumstances. Acknowledging mistakes without elaborate self-defense. These behaviors accumulate quietly into a reputation that precedes you into rooms you haven't entered yet. Opening doors that would stay closed to someone with identical skills but weaker credibility. The highest level of social intelligence, though, is something beyond individual relationship management. It's the ability to create situations where multiple people's interests align, where collaboration produces outcomes that individual effort couldn't access. This requires a kind of systems thinking applied to human dynamics, seeing not just what you need and what another person needs, but how those needs might be structured into a mutual opportunity that serves everyone involved more fully than any of them could serve themselves alone. When you become genuinely skilled at this, at creating genuine mutual benefit rather than negotiating zero-sum transactions, something changes in how people relate to you. They stop experiencing your presence as a request or a pitch. They start experiencing it as an asset. They bring things to you. They include you. They advocate for you in rooms where you aren't present. That's not influence as persuasion. That's influence as gravity. And it's built entirely from the quality of value you create for others over time. The social game was never about being likable. It was always about being genuinely useful. Chapter 10. Why small advantages become enormous gaps. Imagine two ships leaving the same port on the same morning, carrying the same cargo, headed for the same general region of the world. At departure, they are side by side, virtually indistinguishable. But one ship's navigation is set 1 degree off from the others. Just 1 degree. In the first hour, the difference between their positions is negligible. After a day, the gap is noticeable but not alarming. After a week, they're in meaningfully different waters. After a month, they're approaching different coastlines entirely. After a year, they're on opposite sides of an ocean. 1 degree, compounded over time, producing destinations that share almost nothing. We tend to think about advantage in terms of dramatic differentials. The genius versus the ordinary person. The naturally gifted versus everyone else. These gaps are real and they matter. But they're not actually where most of the consequential divergence in human outcomes originates. Most of the divergence comes from small, consistent differences in how people think, decide, process, and respond. Differences that seem almost invisible in any given moment, but compound with mathematical relentlessness over months and years and decades. Someone who makes slightly better decisions than the people around them. Not dramatically better, just consistently slightly better. Does not end up with slightly better outcomes. They end up in a completely different category of life, because each better decision creates slightly better conditions, which make slightly better decisions more likely, which creates slightly better conditions still. The improvement feeds itself. It curves upward. And the gap between that person and someone making slightly worse decisions consistently widens, not at a steady rate, but at an accelerating one. This is the compound effect applied not to money, but to human capability. And it has a dark mirror that deserves equal attention. Compounding works in both directions with identical mathematical precision. Small mental habits that seem harmless, the slight tendency to avoid difficult conversations, the mild habit of reframing failures as other people's fault, the gentle drift toward comfort over challenge. These don't stay small. They compound. The person who slightly avoids accountability doesn't stay slightly avoidant. Over years, they build an entire psychological architecture around deflection that becomes progressively harder to dismantle. This is why what you do daily matters so disproportionately compared to what you do occasionally. Occasional excellence cannot outcompete consistent mediocrity over a long enough time horizon. Because mediocrity, if it's consistent, compounds. And occasional excellence, if it's occasional, doesn't. The practical implication is counterintuitive but important. In the early stages of any developmental effort, the returns are small and slow relative to the effort invested. This is precisely when most people conclude the approach isn't working and abandon it. But this is the period that determines everything, where the foundation is being laid for the later high-return phase. Abandoning the process during the foundation phase means the compounding never arrives. The investment is lost, not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't continued long enough to reach the inflection point where growth becomes visible. Not all improvements compound equally. Some capabilities are foundational. They improve the acquisition and application of every other capability simultaneously. Decision-making quality is foundational in this way. Better decisions create better conditions across every domain, which creates more opportunities for better decisions. Emotional regulation is foundational. Learning itself is perhaps the most foundational of all, because it directly determines the rate at which every other capability develops. This suggests a specific priority. Instead of trying to improve everything simultaneously, which disperses effort and produces shallow, unsustained improvements, identify the 2 or 3 foundational capabilities that would most powerfully accelerate everything else. Invest there first, deeply and consistently, until the compounding becomes visible. The 1-degree difference becomes a different ocean. The small daily choice becomes an entirely different life. Not through luck, not through some dramatic turning point, but through the patient, persistent, mathematically inevitable accumulation of small advantages maintained long enough to compound into something extraordinary. The question worth sitting with is not whether this is true. The mathematics are unambiguous. The question is whether you're going to choose your daily practices with full awareness of what they're actually building. Slowly, invisibly, one compounding day at a time. Chapter 11. What mastery actually feels like. There's a fantasy about mastery that's almost universally held and almost universally wrong. You work hard for long enough, develop sufficient skill, and eventually arrive at a place where things become easy. Where the problems that once frustrated you no longer arise. Where your competence is so complete that you move through your domain with effortless grace. This fantasy is not just inaccurate, It's actively harmful because it causes people to misinterpret the actual experience of genuine mastery when they encounter it, and draw exactly the wrong conclusions from what they find. Here's what mastery actually feels like from the inside. It feels like a continuous encounter with increasingly sophisticated problems that were completely invisible at lower levels of competence. It feels like the permanent displacement of one set of challenges by a more complex, more demanding, more interesting set. The chess grandmaster doesn't experience chess as simple. They experience it as more layered than any beginner could comprehend, populated with strategic dimensions and psychological depths that simply don't exist at lower levels of play. The problems don't disappear with mastery. They become richer. This pattern is universal. The beginning entrepreneur struggles with making the first sale. The experienced entrepreneur struggles with building a culture that survives rapid scaling. The elite entrepreneur contends with legacy and disruption at a level where almost no one around them has relevant experience to offer. Each stage brings genuinely harder problems, not harder in the same way, but harder in new ways that require capabilities the previous stage never demanded. When you advance to a higher level and find yourself confronted with unexpected new difficulties, the natural interpretation is that something has gone wrong, that you've moved beyond your competence. This interpretation is precisely backwards. New difficulties at a higher level are the signature of genuine advancement. They mean you've developed enough capability to access problems that were previously beyond your reach. The psychological orientation that makes this navigable is what researchers call growth orientation, and its distinction from performance orientation is one of the most consequential in all of psychology. Performance-oriented people organize their efforts around demonstrating existing competence. They choose situations where they're likely to succeed, avoid situations where failure is probable, and experience difficulty primarily as a threat to their self-image. Their identity is tied to performing well, which means situations where performance falters feel like identity threats. The consequence is systematic avoidance of precisely the situations where the most learning occurs. Growth-oriented people organize their efforts around expanding capability. They actively seek situations where failure is possible, because failure is the primary mechanism through which learning happens. Their identity is tied not to performing well, but to developing, which means difficulty isn't threatening. It's informative. Growth orientation sounds obviously preferable, and intellectually most people embrace it immediately. But emotionally, in the actual moment of potential failure, most people revert to performance orientation regardless of their stated values. The practice of genuine growth orientation is not a one-time philosophical commitment. It's a continuous, moment-by-moment choice to prioritize what you're learning over how you're appearing. This connects directly to deliberate practice, the concept developed by psychologist Anders Ericsson through decades of studying expert performers. Deliberate practice is not the same as practice. Most people practice by repeating what they can already do, reinforcing existing competence, staying in the comfortable zone of demonstrated ability. It produces fluency in what you already know rather than competence in what you don't. Deliberate practice requires identifying the precise boundaries of your current competence, the specific things you cannot yet do, the situations where your performance reliably deteriorates, and designing practice that directly targets those boundaries. True masters spend disproportionate time on their weaknesses, their gaps, their failure modes, not from perfectionism, but from genuine commitment to accurate self-assessment in service of continued development. The highest level of mastery involves generating new frameworks rather than executing excellently within existing ones. This creative mastery almost always emerges from genuine depth across more than one field. The unexpected synthesis of ideas from different domains, producing something neither domain could have generated alone. Mastery is not a destination with a comfortable chair. It's a continuously advancing frontier. The horizon keeps moving. The craft keeps deepening. That's not a burden. For anyone genuinely in love with what they do, it's the only arrangement worth having. Chapter 12. The plateau is not the wall. There's a specific kind of discouragement that arrives not at the beginning of an effort, when everything is hard and unfamiliar, but somewhere in the middle, after you've put in real work, developed genuine competence, and can look back clearly at how far you've come. It arrives quietly, without announcement. You realize that despite continuing effort, despite showing up consistently, despite doing everything that previously produced improvement, you're not improving anymore. The needle has stopped moving. This is the plateau. And the interpretation you place on it in that moment will determine almost everything that follows. Most people interpret a plateau as evidence that they've reached their natural ceiling, that they've extracted whatever improvement was available to them, and this, right here, right now, is simply the level they're at. This interpretation feels reasonable because it accounts for the evidence. You're working. You're not improving. What other conclusion is there? There is another conclusion, and it's more accurate. Plateaus are not ceilings, they're transitions. They mark the boundary between one stage of development and the next. A boundary that requires a qualitatively different approach to cross. Not simply more of the same effort that brought you here. Think about language learning. A beginner improves rapidly and visibly. New words, new structures, new capability appearing almost daily. Then, somewhere around intermediate proficiency, improvement seems to stop. The learner can communicate, can understand most of what they hear, can navigate most situations. But fluency, the effortless, automatic, native-feeling use of the language, remains stubbornly out of reach despite continued study and practice. This plateau isn't failure, it's consolidation. The brain is integrating thousands of individually learned elements into unified, automatic patterns. A process that is genuinely invisible from the outside and feels like stagnation from the inside. The learner who understands this pushes through. The learner who interprets it as a ceiling stops, often mere weeks before the consolidation completes, and fluency suddenly, almost magically, becomes accessible. The first step through any plateau is accurate diagnosis, because different plateaus have different causes, and applying the wrong remedy wastes time and compounds frustration. Some plateaus occur because you've been practicing the same things in the same ways for too long, and your brain has optimized current performance to the point where it no longer needs to create new neural pathways. The solution is deliberate introduction of difficulty, harder problems, unfamiliar contexts, higher standards. Force the brain to develop new capabilities rather than refine existing ones. Other plateaus occur because you've reached the limit of what self-directed practice can reveal. You've developed blind spots, consistent gaps in your performance that you literally cannot see from the inside because your existing mental model of your own capability filters them out. The solution here isn't more practice. It's better feedback, a coach, a mentor, a peer who is sufficiently skilled and sufficiently honest to show you what you cannot show yourself. There are also plateaus that are fundamentally psychological rather than technical, where the barrier isn't skill but identity, a deep, unexamined resistance to becoming the person the next level requires. This is more common than most people realize, and more honest than most people want to be with themselves. Advancement sometimes requires abandoning ways of seeing yourself that have become comfortable and familiar. the expert who must become a beginner again in an adjacent domain, the individual performer who must become a leader, the person who has built their identity around a particular approach and must now let that approach go in service of a more sophisticated one. These identity plateaus are the hardest to break through precisely because the resistance is invisible. It doesn't feel like fear of change. It feels like reasonable skepticism about whether the new approach is really better. It feels like loyalty to what has worked. It feels like wisdom when it is actually attachment. Breaking through requires the willingness to be temporarily worse in service of becoming permanently better. To accept the discomfort of operating outside your established identity long enough for a new, more capable identity to form. The plateau is not the wall. It's the invitation to develop differently than you have before. Accept the invitation. Chapter 13. Leading from the inside. Think about the last time a group of people faced genuine uncertainty together. A team confronting a difficult problem. A family navigating a crisis. A room full of people waiting for direction that wasn't coming from the expected source. In those moments, something interesting happens. People don't automatically look to whoever has the highest title or the loudest voice. They look, almost instinctively, toward whoever seems to understand what's happening and know what to do. That gravitational pull toward clarity is one of the most consistent and underappreciated dynamics in human social behavior. And it operates completely independently of formal authority. This is what leadership through mental development actually means. Not the management of tasks and people from a position of organizational power. The capacity to provide genuine clarity in conditions of genuine confusion. To see signal in noise. To remain functional when others are overwhelmed. To make decisions of sufficient quality that people around you naturally orient toward your judgment. This kind of leadership isn't claimed. It's recognized. And it can't be faked, because it emerges from actual capability rather than positional authority. The foundation is everything we've already discussed. Superior mental models allow you to perceive patterns in complex situations that others, navigating the same information with less sophisticated frameworks, simply cannot see. Emotional mastery allows you to maintain cognitive clarity under exactly the conditions. Pressure, uncertainty, high stakes, where most people's thinking deteriorates most sharply. The contrast this creates in a high-pressure environment is stark and immediately felt by everyone present. You become the still point in a turning room. But there's a shift that genuine leadership requires that goes beyond individual capability. And it's a shift that many highly capable people resist, sometimes for years, because it feels like a diminishment rather than an expansion. The shift is from being the person who has the best answers to being the person who develops the best thinking in others. Individual excellence is, ultimately, a limited resource. There are only so many hours, only so much cognitive bandwidth, only so many problems one mind can engage with simultaneously. The person who remains the answer provider, who takes pride in being the most capable person in the room and unconsciously structures situations to confirm that, hits a ceiling determined entirely by their individual capacity. Their team hits that same ceiling because they've been trained to bring problems rather than solve them. The leader who develops thinking in others operates without that ceiling. Every person whose decision-making improves becomes a multiplier. Every team member who develops better judgment expands the collective capacity of the entire group. The leverage is exponential in a way that individual excellence simply cannot match. This requires a fundamental reorientation of what you consider your actual job in any collaborative context. Your job is not to solve the problem. Your job is to ask the question that helps the person in front of you solve the problem. And in doing so, develop the capability to solve similar problems independently in the future. This is harder than solving it yourself. It requires patience. It requires genuine curiosity about how other people think rather than impatience with how differently they think than you do. It requires the ability to hold back your own answer long enough for someone else to find theirs. There's also the matter of what you model. Leadership through mental superiority is not primarily instructional. It's demonstrative. The way you respond to setbacks teaches more than any speech about resilience. The quality of your thinking under pressure teaches more than any framework about decision-making. The honesty with which you acknowledge your own errors teaches more about intellectual integrity than any stated value about transparency. People don't follow what leaders say nearly as consistently as they follow what leaders do. And what leaders do in the difficult, unscripted, genuinely pressured moments. That's the curriculum everyone in the room is absorbing, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. The person who isn't the loudest, but becomes the one everyone looks to when things get complicated. They didn't get there through authority or performance. They got there through consistent demonstration of a mind that works well precisely when working well is hardest. That's the only leadership that lasts. Chapter 14. Thinking about how you think. There's a craftsman I read about once who had spent 40 years working with wood. What distinguished him from other skilled woodworkers wasn't the number of tools he owned or even his technical precision, though both were considerable. It was something subtler. Before beginning any project, he would stand at his workbench and look at the wood for a long time, sometimes minutes, apparently doing nothing. When a young apprentice finally asked what he was doing during those silent minutes, the craftsman said simply, "I'm deciding which kind of thinking this piece requires." That answer contains something most people spend their entire lives without accessing. We treat thinking as a single activity, something you either do or don't do well or poorly, have more or less of. But thinking isn't one thing. It's a collection of distinct cognitive processes: analytical reasoning, creative association, strategic planning, pattern recognition, evaluative judgment. Each operating through different neural mechanisms, each suited to different kinds of problems, each capable of being consciously engaged or disengaged, depending on what the situation actually requires. Most people use the same cognitive mode for everything. They bring analytical thinking to problems that require creative intuition. They apply creative brainstorming to situations that require clear evaluative judgment. They use fast pattern matching in contexts that demand slow, systematic reasoning. Not because they've considered these options and chosen poorly, but because they've never considered these options at all. They have one hammer, and they bring it to everything. Which means some problems get solved efficiently, and others get systematically mishandled in ways that feel inexplicable. Metacognition, thinking about your own thinking, is the capacity that breaks this pattern. It's the ability to step back from the content of your thoughts and observe the process generating them. To notice not just what you're thinking, but how you're thinking. Whether that mode of thinking is suited to the problem at hand, and what a more appropriate mode might look like. This sounds abstract until you experience the practical reality of it. You're stuck on a creative problem, cycling through the same analytical frameworks that keep producing the same inadequate solutions. Metacognitive awareness lets you notice that you're stuck not because the solution doesn't exist, but because the mode of thinking you're applying is inappropriate for finding it. You consciously disengage the analytical mode, deliberately, intentionally, and allow more associative, nonlinear thinking to operate. You take a walk, you let the problem sit in the background. You approach it from an oblique angle rather than directly. The solution, very often, arrives not through harder application of the wrong tool, but through switching to the right one. Developing metacognitive skill begins with building a basic map of your own cognitive tendencies. What's your default mode? Most people have one. The cognitive style that feels most natural, most like thinking, most like themselves. For analytically trained people, it's usually systematic, logical reasoning. For creatively oriented people, it's usually associative, lateral, image-rich thinking. For action-oriented people, it's usually fast, pattern-based, intuitive processing. Your default mode is genuinely valuable. It's likely one of your real strengths. The problem is when it becomes your only mode. When the analyst cannot access intuition. When the creative thinker cannot commit to systematic evaluation. When the action-oriented person cannot slow down enough for the kind of patient, careful reasoning that complex problems sometimes demand. The practice is deliberate expansion, consciously, regularly working in cognitive modes that don't come naturally. Not to replace your default strength, but to build genuine flexibility, the ability to recognize what a situation requires and access it, rather than defaulting to whatever feels most comfortable. There's a deeper level still, which some researchers describe as meta-metacognition, awareness of your metacognitive patterns themselves, noticing not just which thinking mode you're in, but your habitual tendencies around when and how you switch modes. Whether you tend to persist too long with one approach before reconsidering, whether you switch too quickly before an approach has had time to yield results. The craftsman standing at his workbench wasn't wasting time. He was doing the most important work of all, deciding, before touching anything, exactly what kind of thinking the problem deserved. That pause, practiced consistently, is worth more than years of undirected effort. Chapter 15. Building a mind that lasts. There's a jazz musician I once read about who, at 73 years old, still practiced scales for 2 hours every morning before doing anything else. Not because he needed to. He'd spent 50 years performing at the highest levels of his craft. The scales were technically unnecessary, muscle memory so deep it would never meaningfully degrade. When asked why he still practiced them, he said something I've never forgotten. The day I stop practicing is the day I start forgetting what kind of musician I am. He wasn't talking about technical decay. He was talking about identity, about the relationship between daily practice and the ongoing project of being a particular kind of person. The scales weren't maintaining his fingers. They were maintaining his commitment to the craft as a living, active, daily thing, rather than a past achievement he was coasting on. This is the essence of what it means to build a mind that lasts. Everything we've covered in this journey together, the upgraded operating system, the examined beliefs, the quality decisions, the anti-fragile relationship with difficulty, the consistent performance, the mental models, the emotional mastery, the compounding systems, the social intelligence, the understanding of mastery and plateaus and leadership and metacognition. None of it is a one-time installation. None of it is a destination you reach and then maintain effortlessly from a comfortable chair. It's a practice, a living, daily, renewable commitment to operating at the level you've developed and continuing to develop further. The first threat to that commitment is what psychologists call hedonic adaptation, the brain's tendency to normalize new conditions, however significantly improved, and return to a baseline level of engagement and satisfaction. The mental capabilities you've developed through genuine effort become, over time, simply how you are. Your new normal. And new normals, precisely because they feel normal, stop receiving the deliberate attention that created them. The practices that built the capability quietly erode. The standards that felt elevated become invisible. You don't regress dramatically. You drift, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day something happens that reveals the gap between where you are and where you were. The protection against drift isn't heroic effort. It's structural maintenance, building into your regular life the minimum practices that sustain the capabilities you've built. Regular reading of genuinely challenging material. Periodic exposure to people whose thinking surpasses yours in ways that create productive discomfort. Deliberate review of your decisions, your emotional responses, your patterns. Not for judgment, but for calibration. These practices don't need to be elaborate. They need to be consistent, and they need to be protected from the inevitable pressure of everything else that wants that time. The second threat is isolation, the gradual narrowing of your intellectual and social environment to a comfortable circle of familiar ideas and agreeable people. Nothing degrades a mind faster than the absence of genuine challenge from outside itself. The echo chamber feels pleasant. It is intellectually lethal. Sustaining mental excellence requires sustained exposure to perspectives that don't confirm your existing views, problems that don't yield to your established approaches, people who are genuinely better than you at things that matter to you. This requires deliberate curation. Your information diet, your relationships, your professional challenges. These need periodic examination and intentional expansion. Not constant disruption, but regular renewal. The question to ask annually, perhaps more often, is whether your current environment is still demanding enough to continue producing growth, or whether it has become comfortable enough to begin producing stagnation. The final and most important thing I want to leave with you is this. The goal of everything we've discussed is not performance. It's not achievement. It's not even success in the conventional sense of that word. The goal is a particular quality of engagement with your own life, the quality of someone who is genuinely present to their own development, genuinely invested in their own thinking, genuinely committed to becoming more capable, more clear, more useful, more wise as the years accumulate rather than less. That commitment, renewed daily, is what a lasting mind is made of. The musician plays his scales. The mind does its work, not because it must, because this is what it means to take the gift of a human mind seriously. Conclusion. The only question that remains. There's a door that has been unlocked for as long as you can remember. You've walked past it hundreds of times. Thousands, maybe. You've noticed it. You've thought about what might be on the other side. You've told yourself you'd open it when the timing was better, when you felt more ready, when the conditions were right. The door has never been locked. The only thing that kept it closed was the decision to open it. That's where we are right now. We've covered a great deal of ground together, the ancient survival wiring that runs your default responses, the beliefs installed in emotional moments that have been quietly governing your perception of what's possible, the decisions, large and small, that accumulate into a life, the gift concealed inside difficulty, the structure of consistent performance that doesn't depend on motivation to function, the mental maps that determine the quality of your navigation, the emotional mastery that preserves your best thinking precisely when it's most needed, the mathematics of small, consistent motion compounded over time, the social intelligence that multiplies individual capability into collective possibility, the compounding gaps produced by small, sustained advantages, the reality of mastery as an advancing frontier rather than a comfortable destination, the plateau as transition rather than ceiling, leadership as clarity offered to others rather than authority exercised over them, the metacognitive flexibility to choose how you think rather than defaulting to a single mode forever. And the daily practice that sustains everything, not because it's required by external obligation, but because it's the expression of someone who takes their own mind seriously. None of this is theoretical. Every framework here has roots in real psychology, real neuroscience, real observation of how people actually develop over time. But I want to be honest with you about something as we finish. Knowing all of it changes nothing on its own. Knowledge without application is just a more sophisticated story you tell yourself about why you're different from the people around you who aren't doing the work either. I didn't write this to give you a better story. I wrote it to give you a better life, and those are only the same thing if you actually use what you've been given. So here is the only question that remains, and it's not complicated. What are you going to do today? Not someday. Not when conditions improve. Not when you feel sufficiently ready. But today, with what you now understand. Pick one thing. Just one. The belief you're finally going to examine honestly. The decision framework you're going to apply to the choice you've been avoiding. The daily practice you're going to begin at its smallest possible version. The difficult conversation you're going to stop postponing. The edge of your current competence you're going to deliberately approach, rather than safely avoid. One thing. Today. With full commitment rather than partial intention. Then tomorrow, another. Not a revolution, a direction. Sustained long enough for compounding to do what compounding always does. Turn the invisible into the undeniable. The mind that wins consistently isn't a different kind of mind than yours. It's your mind, deliberately developed. Examined, upgraded, practiced, and maintained with the same seriousness you'd bring to anything else you genuinely care about building. The door is unlocked. It always has been. The only question that ever mattered is whether you're ready to open it.